Hello, and thanks for joining me for another UK version of Lights Out, your virtual campfire. I'm your hostess with the mostest ghosties, Sylvia Schultz. Our time in England and Scotland involves not only the paranormal, but also a healthy dose of true crime. One of the intriguing stories that was new to me on this trip was the eerie tale of Dr. Crippen, a henpecked husband who took the ultimate revenge. Join me for a stroll through a London suburb with a dark secret as we go lights out. 39 Hilldrop Crescent. It sounds like it should be a lovely little English address, perhaps a cottage with flower boxes at the windows. Instead, this apartment building sits in a busy neighborhood of London. And in 1910, it became the scene of one of the most gruesome crimes in modern English history. Our host for the trip, Paul Adams, told us the story in a nutshell. We'll listen to him tell the tale, then I'll fill you in on some details. A quick note, Paul says that Inspector Drew was on the case. It was actually Chief Inspector Walter Dew.
Yeah, I can send it to you. Yeah, sure. So we're here in Camden, in North London, and this is the site of 39 Hilldrop Crescent, and this is a famous true crime location in British crime. This is the place where the house on this site where Dr. Crippen murdered his wife, Cora Crippen, in 1910. He was having an affair with his secretary, a lady called Ethel Lenave, and Cora Crippen, she disappeared, and Ethel Lenave moved into the house and started openly wearing Mrs. Crippen's jewellery and her furs and things like that. And then, and she was like a music hall performer. She performed on stage, like in vaudeville and things like that. And one of her colleagues in that profession, I think her stage name was Volcana. She was a female strongwoman. She went to the police and was concerned that she hadn't seen Mrs. Crippen for quite some time. And the police came round to 39 Hilldrop Crescent, and Inspector Drew from Scotland Yard interviewed Crippen. Crippen had told people that his wife had died, she'd returned to Canada, that's they were native Canadians, and that she'd died and been buried. Drew came round and spoke with him, interviewed Crippen, and he admitted that what he'd said was a lie. It wasn't true. He was embarrassed. His wife, apparently, he said that his wife had left him and that she'd run off with somebody, a fellow actor, and he was embarrassed, so he made up that story. Drew was actually satisfied with Crippen's explanation. He toured the house. He was fine. He accepted the explanation and left, but Crippen didn't know that. And so he and Ethel Lenave were frightened, so they fled. They did a moonlight flit. They fled to Belgium, and then they managed to get on a steamer ship, the SS Montrose, back to Canada. So some of Mrs. Crippen's friends again went to the police and said, look, they've vanished. So they searched the house 3 times, and finally in the cellar, in under here, they found the remains of a body. It was more or less like a mass of flesh. There was no skeleton, no head, nothing. None of that was ever found. But they managed to identify the body as Mrs. Crippen through I think it was an appendix scar on some of the tissue they found out. And so they issued a warrant for Crippen's arrest. And Crippen was travelling first class on the SS Montrose. If he'd have travelled third class, he probably would have got there undetected. But because he was travelling first class, he had dinner at the captain's table, and Ethel Lenave was dressed up as a boy. And they tried to disguise herself as a boy. And the captain clocked this, and before the SS Montrose sailed out a telegraph range, sent a telegraph to London and said, I believe that Crippen, the London Cellar Murderer, is on board this ship. And so Crippen was actually the first murderer to actually be caught by wireless telegraphy. So Drew got on a faster ship, postal ship, that passed the SS Montrose in the night, got to Quebec, got to Canada before Crippen arrived, and then Crippen's ship docked. Drew went on board and was literally waiting on the gangplank when Crippen came out, and he walked down the gangplank, and Drew stepped forward and said, "Good morning, Dr. Crippen, I'm Inspector Drew from Scotland Yard." So, and he was arrested, came back, was tried. Leneve was found guilty as an accessory, but she wasn't. She was, I think she served a period of imprisonment. She lived into the late 1960s. Crippen was executed at Pentonville, and his ghost is supposedly said to still walk this area around the site of the old house. There used to be a pond somewhere near here, and Peter Underwood has an account of it in his book Haunted London, that on occasions a figure, presumably maybe even with a bundle in his hands, that may even be the head of Mrs. Crippen, being deposited in the pond, and then the figure moving away. But yeah, it's one of the great British true crime stories. And now this house was actually struck by in the Blitz. It was struck by a bomb, destroyed, and the site's now been redeveloped. Margaret Bonfield House here is like a block of flats or like an apartment project. And
how was he executed? Was he hanged?
He was hanged. Yeah, he was hanged at Pentonville. And Peter Underwood actually interviewed the Death Watch warder, who actually spent a lot of time with Crippen, and said that he was a very mild-mannered man, very pleasant, didn't make any fuss at all, and all he did was ask the time, which he did about every 10 minutes. So so that's a great story. And it's all happened here, 39 Hilldrop Crescent.
Very good.
Wow.
Yes, it would have been more or less like this, wouldn't it? This one.
Ah.
Very similar.
Very similar to
yeah,
what the
that's
house.
it. I mean, that's the building of that period. And it's got where the body was discovered, buried under the floor, would have been in the space underneath those stairs, you know. So if you flip it over, it would have been in this area where that pigeon is now. There, in that area there.
Okay.
But, I mean, there's been some debate as to whether it was actually Mrs. Crippen's body that they found, but I think. But I can't see why.
Whose else could it be?
Who else could it have been? Yeah. But, no, it's a great story.
Yeah, it is.
And they made a really good film of it in 1962 with Donald Pleasance played Dr. Crippen.
Oh
so,
my!
What was the name of the story? Do you remember?
The film is just called Dr. Crippen. And, Donald Pleasance plays Crippen.
Oh, I have to. It does.
Because he looks the part with the bald head, you know, and Crippen.
Okay.
That was a movie.
Movie, yeah. Crippen had a bald head, little moustache and stuff, and I remember seeing the waxwork they did of him in the old Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussauds in London. They had a Crippen standing at the dock of the Old Bailey.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it's a cool story.
Nice.
Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen and his wife Cora moved into the apartment building at 39 Hilldrop Crescent in September 1905. Dr. Crippen and Cora had married in 1894. He and his new wife moved to London from the U.S. in 1897, and Crippen took a job as a sales rep for a company called Munyon's Remedies, which sold homeopathic medicines. Cora Crippen fancied herself a performer and took the stage name Belle Elmore. She had dreams of taking the London music scene by storm, but unfortunately she had absolutely zero talent. Dr. Crippen supported his wife's dreams, but her career went nowhere. Cora, already a strong personality, became prickly when her dreams of stardom fell flat. She became increasingly difficult to live with. Part of the reason the Crippens moved into the building at 39 Hilldrop Crescent was because there was enough room for the couple to have separate bedrooms. and soon Crippen was having an affair with his typist, Ethel Leneve. On January 31st, 1910, the Crippens hosted another couple, Paul and Clara Martinetti, for a dinner party. Halfway through the meal, Paul needed to use the facilities. The Martinettis were good friends and had been to Hilldrop Crescent many times, so Crippen just sort of waved Paul down the hall to the bathroom. But because he didn't get up from the table and personally escort Paul, Cora tore him a new one for being rude and inconsiderate. The Martinettis left around 1 a.m. That was the last time they, or anyone else, saw Cora Crippen alive. By the end of February, Ethel Leneve had moved in with Crippen. She made herself right at home, wearing Cora's jewelry and furs to parties. This naturally attracted some attention from Cora's friends, and they started wondering where Cora was. One of these friends, Kate Williams, went to the police with her suspicions. She wasn't taken very seriously, probably because her persona on stage was a circus strongwoman named Vulcana. But soon other friends of Cora's were also contacting the police. Chief Inspector Walter Dew of Scotland Yard was put on the case. Inspector Dew came to Hilldrop Crescent for a visit. He found Ethel Leneve there, who told him that Dr. Crippen was at work. Dew paid a call on Crippen and had a chat with him. The two men came back to Crippen's house, and Dew had a look around. Crippen told him that Cora had gone back to her native Canada, and that she had unfortunately died and been cremated. Then all of a sudden, Crippen changed his story. He told Dew that no, Cora wasn't dead after all. She had actually run away with a music hall actor she had met in late 1903, a fellow named Bruce Miller. Crippen confessed to Dew that he'd just been too embarrassed to tell him the truth. Dew felt sorry for the henpecked little man. He believed him, but suggested that it would be better if Cora herself could confirm the story. Crippen promised to take an ad out in the newspaper to contact Cora and tell her to get in touch with Dew. The chief inspector left, but Crippen and Leneve were spooked. The first thing Crippen did was shave his distinctive mustache. The second thing he did was run, with Leneve in tow, to Brussels. Then he booked them both passage to Canada on the SS Montrose, and they traveled as father and son, with Ethel disguised as a boy. Crippen and Leneve were not very good at being on the run. Instead of keeping their heads down in third class, they dined at the captain's table every night of the voyage. Meanwhile, Scotland Yard decided to have another look at 39 Hilldrop Crescent. They searched the house 3 times, attic to cellar, and on the third pass they made a horrifying discovery under some loose bricks in the floor of the cellar. It was a bundle of flesh wrapped in the top of a pair of pajamas. No bones, no limbs, no head, but they were pretty darn sure they'd just found Cora Crippen. The news of the London Cellar Murderer traveled fast, and even reached Captain Kendall of the Montrose. He'd noticed that the father and son who'd boarded the ship at Antwerp were very affectionate. They were always holding hands. And the son's clothing was suspiciously ill-fitting. Kendall sent a telegraph to Scotland Yard just before the Montrose sailed out of range. Dew jumped on a mail ship that was faster than the Montrose, and reached Quebec ahead of his quarry. When he came aboard the Montrose, he greeted his perp with the mic drop, "Hello, Dr. Crippen. I'm Chief Inspector Dew from Scotland Yard." Crippen froze, then his shoulders sagged. He knew he'd been made. He became the first criminal to be caught using wireless technology. Dr. Crippen was put on trial for Cora's murder. His defense was absurdly simple. He just said that the body, what there was of it, wasn't Cora's. In fact, he said the gruesome bundle had probably been buried in the cellar even before he and Cora moved in. The prosecution's detective work poked holes in that dubious theory pretty quickly. One of the gobbets of flesh in the shallow grave bore a scar. Medical records showed that Cora had the exact same scar on her stomach. Also, the body was wearing Cora's underwear. Medical tests revealed that the flesh contained a large quantity of an anti-nausea drug, scopolamine, which can be poisonous in large doses. Crippen, as it turned out, had purchased 5 grains of scopolamine on January 17th, just before Cora had gone missing. The jury took just 27 minutes to find Crippen guilty. Ethel Leneve was tried as an accessory to murder. She was found not guilty. Crippen was hanged at Pentonville Prison on November 23, 1910. His last request was that a photograph of Ethel and some of her letters be placed in his coffin. The request was granted. We visited Cora Crippen's grave at Islington St. Pancras Cemetery in London. It is one of the most light-hearted, cheerful cemeteries I've ever been to, but Cora's grave is tucked away in the deep shade under some trees. You really have to know where to look to find her, and even then you have to bushwhack a bit to get to her grave. I'm sure no one visits her by accident. Dr. Crippen's ghost has been seen in the vacant lot near where 39 Hilldrop Crescent used to stand. The ghost often shows up on January 31st, the anniversary of the date Cora was murdered. The phantom, identified by his bug eyes and drooping mustache, walks towards the site where a small pond used to be, carrying a bulky package under one arm. Then it disappears. A dark form is later seen coming from the other direction, walking back from the pond empty-handed. Could this be the ghost of Dr. Crippen, forever reenacting his disposal of Cora's head? Another little village we went to was the town of Stevenage. While we were there, Paul said he had a little extra surprise for us, but that we had to be quick about looking at it, as it was in private property. He parked, and we walked to a courtyard behind a bank. At one side of the yard was a shed with a sway-backed roof. Paul said that the front used to be open and you could just walk right in, but the property changed hands, and the new owner put doors on the shed. But the gap between the top of the doors and the bottom of the sagging roof meant that we could peek inside. There, up in the rafters of the shed, was a coffin. It looked like a crate, and it is. The coffin is inside, lined with lead to keep the initial smell of decomp down. Henry Trigg had a deep fear of grave robbers and resurrection men, nefarious characters who would dig up a freshly buried corpse and sell it to a medical school for dissection. So when he died in 1724, his friends carried out his final wishes and put his coffin in the rafters of his house. At some point after that, the coffin was moved to the rafters of this shed. Unfortunately, Trigg's plan backfired. Drunken soldiers during World War I broke into his coffin and stole a bunch of his bones. Bits of him disappeared through the years until now there's nothing left of Henry Trigg. He was so freaked out about grave robbers, if he'd been buried in the conventional way, he'd still be resting peacefully in his grave. Trigg's ghost has been seen in the building next to the shed in the 1960s, when it was the National Westminster Bank. He appeared as a man wearing a striped apron. I hope you've enjoyed this look at one of the many delightful oddities around London, and one of the city's most gruesome true crime stories. In the next episode, we'll wander around some ghostly sites in St. Albans and take a tour of St. Albans Cathedral. Join me next time as we go lights out.